Becky, and today I'm going to be reading even more self-published fantasy books. I did a video last week which was an hour long, so this week I'm going to split them into 5 books per video, so hopefully it's a little bit more easier to digest. And this week I'm going to be covering 2018's finalists, and I'm going to do the same as what I did last time, which is start from the least ranked to the winner of the competition. If you want to know more about any of these books, you want to see the blurbs, or you want to see what books I'll be reading in the next few weeks, please do go look at the master list that's in the description. In the document I've got kind of all the links to find out more about the books, to find out how to purchase, but I've also got whether they're on Kindle Unlimited, as there's quite a lot of books and I can't afford to buy them all, but Kindle Unlimited is really helping me out with these because I'm paying like £7 a month, but I'm currently on my 2-month free trial, and then you get like all these books. The first book this week is Sowing by Angie Grigaliunas, which is I think how you pronounce her name. And Sowing is about 2 sisters who feel very differently about the current situation in their kind of village. They're currently under the rule of the Hulkondans, which are kind of a military focused people, and so one sister wants to abide by all the laws and keep herself safe and is very timid, and the other one doesn't really agree with this rule and wants to join the rebellion group that's in the city. Both kind of the Hulkondans military and the resistance are not quite good people, not quite bad people. There's a mix of both, and I think this is a really great tension to have, showing that both sides have bad people and both sides are quite morally grey. But because we're reading through the perspective of these 2 girls, I'm expecting it to be quite confusing because we're not sure who we're rooting for, apart from obviously the main characters. Because of the setup, the girls don't know quite who to trust or who to depend on, and I think for a reader that's going to create a lot of tension and confusion as to who we should be trusting and who we should be rooting for in this book. The blurb kind of tells us a basic outline of what's going to happen. One sister's going to join the rebellion, one sister's not. They're going to go through things separately, and then I assume they come together at the end. I'm mostly curious about in this book about how these sisters are going to react to one another, and whether they're going to stay on friendly terms throughout or whether they're going to actually full on fight. Whilst I said I've kind of assumed what will happen and they'll kind of fall out and then get back together and reunite, I'm hoping there's going to be lots of twists and turns between that. And I'm hoping the first hour that I read is going to really show us kind of the sisterly bond that they have and whether they are friendly at the start of the book. First impressions: as soon as you start reading this book, you're thrown into a prologue, which is of someone putting up the posters that I mentioned in the blurb, and this is to undermine the rule in the city. I like this scene because it shows you that someone is trying to take action against the military in the rebellion. However, it then jumps to our main character, who lead a quite boring lives, to be honest. They're both working in kind of menial jobs, and that's what we see throughout the next few chapters. We learn quite early on that Aurelia is very timid and scared, and she's scared particularly of her mother, who's quite abusive, although it's not really explained why she acts like this towards Aurelia, as she really does seem to detest her. And we don't see the same behaviour towards her sister. On the other hand, Rubria, who is very headstrong, and she's already tried joining the rebels, although she's not fully within that group yet because she's still not learnt some things like code words and where they meet and all that kind of stuff. The first 10% of the book definitely focuses on the 2 women and how they've lived their everyday lives. Aurelia is really stressed out all the time because she wants to do a good job and she doesn't want to be punished for not doing things correctly. It also shows that she's a huge pushover towards her friends and her mother and even her sister a little bit, I assume. The other hand, Rubria is a little bit harder to understand, as I think we have less time with her in the first hour, but she's joined the rebels and she's trying to find out more information, and she wants to change the city as it is right now. Rubria also has a kind of backstory with the Hulkondan god, who we don't really know much about apart from that it ended badly and that he's not a very nice person, which I assume is setting up one of the reasons why she joined the rebellion. However, we're not fully sure. So the book was revised about a year ago because the earlier drafts included a lot of violence, apparently had rape and torture scenes which weren't really productive for the book. In the first hour I read, there's nothing like this really. There's very little to say that's bad about it in that regard. However, there were a few things that I pulled out which kind of gave red flags. Our book follows 2 human characters, and there's a very large emphasis on slavery, and that the Itzalan, who are lesser than humans but are human enough to have children with humans are slaves in this world. And I'll go into that a bit more detail, but there's a lot of slavery talked about in this book as if it's normal, and it's very uncomfortable to read because we don't really have anything from at this point where it's going to be overcome and they're going to be set free or anything like that. And if they're freed by our main characters, I don't think that's the correct story to tell because, yeah, it doesn't really work. On top of this, they can have children, so they're both humanoid enough to mate with each other. And in this world, if you're half Itzel half Holkondan, you're called a mixed breed, and that just didn't really sit right with me either. But yeah, I'm really hoping that kind of the prejudice and the propaganda and the terminology used hopefully gets better, but I'm not enjoying it at all right now. We also didn't really get to the pickup of the plot. We're still very much, they're both doing things, they're doing their everyday work lives, and there's not much going on. It was very much focused for the first 10% on who these girls are and why we should care about them, which I'm not quite sure I do care about them that much. So for example, Aurelia is weak and timid and is bullied by her mother, and I think this was done to make you root for her, but I wasn't really rooting for her for that reason. From what I can guess though, they are definitely going to take separate sides despite probably having very similar views, and there's going to be a rebellion, and then it's going to revolve a lot around the Itzelin propaganda that we talked about in the prologue and in some of the rebel discussed scenes. What I did like about this book was the kind of backstory and history and world building, and the emphasis that the history of this world was written by the victors. So the Holkondan have made the Itzelin slaves right now, but apparently there was lots of fighting beforehand, and the Itzelin made the Holkondan slaves at one point, and it's kind of a back and forth. I don't know how true this history is. I do feel like it's used as propaganda to show off the Itzelin as barbaric and less than human, and I'm really interested to see where it goes with that plotline. I feel like this plotline could definitely go very, very wrong, but I'm not sure at this moment how it's going to progress. I think there's a lot of information that's being kept back in this book for later on in the story to be kind of shown to our main characters at the right time, maybe. Would I continue reading this book? Maybe. There's aspects I still didn't like despite it being revised, but I do hope that the fact that it has been revised, that lots of big issues have been resolved, and this is just a blip to show that when the change happens later in the book, it's better. I do hope that the book would bring up that prejudice and slavery in this book is wrong. However, I'm not sure whether I want to continue reading it. I'm sure there's books that I've read in the previous video I did and also in this video that I do want to get to before this book. So there's nothing really pulling me into this book. So I would leave it as a maybe. It's not a priority read for me. The next book I read was The Anointed by Keith Ward. So from the blurb, we find out that Zinlas thinks he's a hero and needs to prove himself to other people. From the way it's kind of written, I'm excited to see whether Zinlas is actually a hero or whether he just thinks he is, because the way the blurb is written just makes it seem very one-sided as to that's what he thinks he is. There's also a lot of questions. I feel like there's a lot of questions rather than knowledge of the plot in the blurb. Some of the questions are things like, how is there a secret hidden village that no one can find? And what is this resource that they're talking about? Is it magic? Is it a weapon? Is it literally just a resource? Who knows, but I'm kind of intrigued as to what's going to come out of this village and what this resource actually is, because apparently it's really powerful. And then there's the mention of a nameless girl that's only described as a orange-haired girl, and I'm not liking this at all. It immediately has a red flag to me that women aren't going to be written well in this book, because the only description you can do is their hair colour and you can't even give them a name on the blurb. So yeah, I hope I'm wrong and that this first hour that I'm reading is going to prove me wrong, but we will see. So after reading the first hour, I was immediately not enjoying this book. The characters aren't great, the world building isn't the best, and there isn't really a great plot line right now. Plus, I want to talk about trigger warnings. So in this book, in just the first hour that I read, there is child or baby kidnapping, baby death, and discussion of more of both of those things. And I really don't think this book is good for anyone who may be going through motherhood right now, or even trying to conceive a child. I think the subjects talked about are horrible, and I definitely think that should be a warning for anyone who was going to pick this book up. But first, let's talk about our main character, Zinla. He is horrible. Like, he's arrogant and cocky. He's basically still a child, but he thinks he's a hero, and he's got an overinflated ego, I think, from really don't understand why. When he was a baby, he was kidnapped and he died during the transfer progress, which I will talk about later. And because he actually survived this transfer instead of dying like many other children do, Zinlas thinks that this is an achievement and he's meant to be a hero and he's more powerful than other people, including his two siblings who are the same age as him and were also kidnapped. His entire behaviour towards this and his siblings just makes him really horrible, and I'm surprised his parents in this book didn't stamp this out. His father is still very present in his life, and he has a stepmother that is actively against the use of transfers and proxies, so you would think that she would be more on the ball with trying to make sure that he doesn't think these things. I also believe he has a lot of disdain towards his siblings, particularly as well, and he thinks he's better than them, despite not a lot really saying that's the case. So a bit of context on the transfers and proxies. In this world, you are given a lifespan and you are told when you come of age how long that years are. In order to gain more life, you can get a proxy who is normally a baby, and it is stated that the best babies for this process are 99-day-old female babies. In order to have a transfer, you then get all of the years that the baby has, and then the baby dies. The concept of the marking and knowing your lifespan and being able to gain more years of your life is a really interesting concept. I just hated the idea of proxies and the fact that you would be gaining life from a baby who is completely innocent and is predominantly female. It's bad enough that they're killing babies, but the fact that it's been said that it's female babies and that male babies are more important to survive, that's kind of the insinuation that's happening, and it just put me off. So the good thing is that our characters in this book, like Danik, who is Sinla's stepmother, who are actively against proxies and are fighting it as the kind of owner of the land, that anyone on the land isn't allowed to have proxies, which I think is really important to have. However, our main character Zinla, his sister, and his father all seem to be for proxies, in the fact that Zinla and his sister plan to get him one if he needs it, and his father has already had, I think it was 2 separate proxies used to gain more life. And I firmly believe we're going to see at least one transfer in this book. I don't know who for, but I think we will. And I really don't want to read about an actual baby death rather than just the theory behind it from the beginning of the book. On top of this, Zinla and his siblings were kidnapped to be proxies at the beginning of their lives. So I don't understand why this family isn't more against it, because they were nearly killed for this process. And if anything, Zinla is more egotistical because he survived the process and is an even worse human being than any of his siblings from these first chapters that I've read. On top of the clear disregard of females because of the baby thing, there's also not well-written female characters in this book. We meet 3 different female characters. One is the stepmother, who is actually quite good but probably won't be in a lot of this book. The second one is Zinla's sister, Imbus. She's very clever and she's very smart and she loves her brother, but the way she's written makes it sound like she's only there to help her brother. And then he undermines her multiple times throughout the book as he sees her as lesser than him. Plus, I believe her family also think this, because during the inheritance gift giving, both of her brothers get something that really means something to them, where she gets a pretty piece of jewelry. And yeah, that immediately kind of gave another red flag about how women are shown in this book. The next woman we meet is the one that's on the cover, who is described as the orange-haired girl, and her name's Greengrass. She actually has a name, which I'm happy about because I was worried she just was going to be named the orange-haired girl throughout the entirety of the book. Her motivation is that she wants to explore past the hidden village that she's stuck in, and she does have some kind of good motivations, but I do think that she's just a write-in to be a love interest further down the line. Of course, this is an assumption and is very subjective opinion from me. From the other parts of this book where they're talking about females and women, I'm not very impressed, so I don't think it's going to be any good later down the line. Overall, there's lots of different elements of this book that I did really like and I would have loved to read about, but I don't think I can push past the fact that this author cannot write female characters and that there's a clear disdain towards them when he does, and so I will not be reading the rest of this book. The next book I read was Out of Nowhere by Patrick Leclerc. This is a book that is so obviously urban fantasy from the blurb that I didn't even need to check it on Goodreads to know it was urban fantasy. Our main character Sean is an immortal healer that is trying to stay low but also help people in this world by being a paramedic. So it's a real world setting and there's some paranormal things going on. But honestly, the blurb doesn't make this book stand out at all. It all feels very common practice to an urban fantasy books, and I'm not quite sure what's going to happen that's going to make it stand out from any other books. I don't know who the villain is, apart from that there is one, and our main character is going to do things to help save the people he loves. But because it is in the top 10 finalists, it must have something that's interesting, surely, if multiple people chose this book to be here. So as soon as we start the book, we're in a little bit of a prologue where it's very action-packed and very action-orientated. We are not seeing our main character in this prologue, however, and we actually, in the next chapter, our main character heals the character doing all the action in the prologue. So this was a little bit confusing for me because I didn't realise these were two separate people until I think I was halfway through the second chapter. But this fully sets up the book from what the blurb says, as he's healed his enemy, which I believe this is the person. Unfortunately, immediately after the prologue, the action kind of dies down quite a lot. We see Sean go about his everyday life, and there's a lot of description of everyday activities like getting ready to go to sleep and cooking. I found this made the book very hard to get into because I was reading basically a day in the life of Sean, and not a lot was happening and nothing was progressing. Like, we were seeing what he was doing in his life, but there wasn't anything that was happening that was going, okay, so he's going to uncover X, Y, and Z, and then that's going to push him forward into the plot. None of that happened. It felt very filler. This, especially after such a fast start, really did make me not want to read it, and I was very slow at reading it, I think, after that. What I did like was that the immortal part of our main character was talked about. He doesn't know whether he doesn't age at all or whether he ages really slowly, and because he's immortal, it's mentioned that he doesn't really remember his childhood or birth or even like a few hundreds of years ago, because memories get replaced. Like, he's immortal but he can't remember everything. Like, can you remember what happened 10 years ago today? No, so neither can he. I really liked this emphasis and this improvement on the immortal part, because I think a lot of books don't really think about that, and there's like immortal vampires who have memory of 2,000 years ago. It doesn't make sense, but this book, it does make sense that you probably would forget quite a lot. I also like that our main character has the powers of healing, and he genuinely wants to help humans heal. He wants to help them, but can't really show off his powers or immortality, so therefore he has to hide it, and to do that he is a paramedic, where he's not scrutinised as much as a doctor, but he's given enough freedom to help people whilst they're in the ambulance before they get to the doctors, and help them just enough so that they're not having huge hospital bills or having to go through major surgery which could kill them and things like that. However, this is another book where women are not written well at all. This is not surprising, especially after all the talks of science fiction fantasy writers this week. However, each of the women that Sean meets in this book is described as attractive and hot. And yes, whilst they are also described as clever and capable and that they can hold their own, the fact that they're all very similar and they're all very attractive, and that is the first description of them, that they're attractive, and that's the main reason why they're in the book, I guess, didn't sit right with me. On top of this, our female character who's introduced, Sarah Diamond, is basically a cool girl from Gone Girl, and she's clearly very attractive and our main character is instantly attracted to her. However, because she's smart and she clearly hasn't been told that she's hot enough time, but she's still attainable. I don't think I can read any more of this book at all after the way women have been written in this. Thankfully, the next book I read was Ruthless Magic, which I've heard of before and does not contain any bad female writing as of yet. So as I said, Ruthless Magic is a book that I've heard of before. I want to say I've heard it's quite good, but I can't quite remember where I've heard of it, why I've heard of it, or how I've heard of it. I did have high hopes going into the book. The book is about teenage mages, and it gave me a very Hunger Games vibe with the exam that they're going into, but it also made me believe, because if you don't pass the exam, you lose your powers. It made me think of the Wizards of Waverly Place movie, which I don't think is where the author was going with this book at all, but that's just what it made me think of. Please comment down below if you've actually were in the age range to watch that movie and know what I'm talking about. So Rocio and Finn are our two main characters, and to be honest, I assume they're going to end up being a couple by the end of the book. It's a YA fantasy, there's two main characters. I think it's a good assumption that this is what's going to happen. It's also explained in the blurb that they have two very different backgrounds, and I'm excited to see whether they actually discuss this between themselves, as I think it's kind of an old magic, new magic thing, where one is seen as lesser than the other, and I'm hoping this is discussed as why they're in the exam. I'm definitely more intrigued by Rocio's chapters than Finn's right now, because I feel like she probably has a more in-depth backstory just from the fact that she's the underdog from the blurb. The book is set in actually a future version of America, so it is a little bit more urban fantasy than what I was expecting. However, we're only really in the magical community, so it's a little bit like Harry Potter, where it's set in the real world, but it is all fantasy all the time, which is actually, I think, made it better than my first assumptions when realizing we were in America. Although we're actually mainly set in New York, and there's some familiar landmarks, like I think Rikers Island was mentioned as the place where the exam is held. I like how the book was set up within New York to show us that there's old magic and they live in kind of upmarket places and they're richer and more powerful, and then the new magic is kind of our lower classes who don't have that much money. So it mirrors real world a lot. So in this book, in order to gain entrance to, I think it's like a college to learn more about magic, you are chosen when you're a certain age, and if you are chosen, you go to learn more magic. If you are not chosen, you will be dampened, which is you still have access to some magic, you just can't use it in the same way. It's explained a lot better in the book than how I just explained it. And then you can also opt to take the exam if you are not chosen, but also if you are chosen, apparently, because that's what Finn does. And the exam is basically this vicious trial which you have to prove yourself and your magical ability, and if you get through it, you're then still going to this college school thing to learn more magic. And if you don't get through it, then you completely lose all your powers. You're not just dampened, you're basically made into a shell of yourself. And this process is definitely built up to favour the old magic and the legacies, and there's a lot of nepotism. So our main character Finn is bad with magic, but his grand uncle is in charge of the board and so can get him a place, despite the fact he probably didn't deserve it, over some of the new magic who are a lot more skilled than him. I liked that the book really explained why new magic people were most likely not chosen. There's the assumption that the kind of board of the mages are suspicious that giving new magic people who are highly skilled magic past the age of, I think it's 16, I can't quite remember, that they will turn against the board and they will make a different rule that's less favourable to them, which, to be honest, I think is a really close to home topic right now. Yeah, that's probably what will happen. They'll probably make it more equal and less favoured to the old magic people. But yeah, all this information is set up quite early on in the book, and I really enjoyed all of it because it really does help you understand this world very quickly. And then you get pulled into the exam. By the time I got to it, I think I was 18% in. We were just about to, like, everyone was outside ready to go take the exam. We meet lots of different characters. It felt very Hunger Games-like because there's like a cast of characters outside of main two point of views, and These were all introduced in different ways and they had different skills and backgrounds and things like that. Ruthless Magic really does focus on its characters. I feel like whilst there was a lot of world building, it was all built depending on the two characters we're shown. So we are shown old magic and we're shown new magic, and we're shown how they are treated differently because of who they are. And this gave us an overview and a backstory of this world and what was happening right now. So speaking of characters, I'm going to quickly take you through kind of Finn and Rocio because they are great characters. Finn Lockwood is old magic and he wants to prove himself that he deserves a spot in the college because he's actually not good at magic, and people who are way better than him but new magic haven't been accepted. This includes Rocio and also his best friend in school, which I'm blanking on the name of right now, but both of these people are probably more highly skilled than him and have been not chosen but want to join the exam in order to prove themselves too. Had a little bit of a tantrum about the nepotism of him being chosen despite other people not being chosen, which is why he signed up to do the exam in the first place. And I both liked that he did this because it showed a very clear flaw in the system, but I disliked it because it's not clear whether only X amount of people in the exam can go through. We don't really know what the exam is at all at this point, so I don't know if he's going to make it worse for other people. Plus, multiple characters in his chapters tell him this exact thing. So his father is like, you're being stupid, his mother disagrees with him, and then his best friend, who's opted to take the exam because she wasn't chosen, also tells him he's pretty stupid for not taking his assured place. And then on the other hand, we have Rocio, who has a very in-depth backstory of a brother who is stubborn but was also not chosen, so took the exam a few years ago and was killed or died during it. Rocio's backstory gave us a lot of information about why she wants to take the exam and prove herself instead of just being dampened like her parents. And because of this, we also see the immediate effects of the exam on people who take them. In her story, we've got her brother who died, but we also have someone else. Because her brother has died, there's a lot of grief there, and we understand immediately that the exam is possibly going to kill her as well. Overall, there was lots of things that I liked, and it was a really quick read. I read 18% in an hour, which means it's probably only like a 5-hour read, but I definitely wanted to read more, and I definitely think I could have got to the end of it in that day if I just kept reading. The next and final book I read for this video is Aching God by Shel. Aching God sounds intriguing, and it immediately sounds like a high fantasy book, which is very different to the other books on this list so far. And because of this, it definitely feels more like a me book. I'm not a huge urban fantasy reader. I do prefer high fantasy when I can get hold of it. So I was pulled into this book pretty quickly. First thing to note from the blurb was that the Barrowlands that are haunted seems very familiar for some reason. I'm not quite sure if there's another book that uses that name. But being haunted and having like an ancient civilization with like malevolent gods all sounds really intriguing, and I really wanted to read more and find out what's going to happen. Plus, gods, the title suggests is going to be a god, and the fact that our main character is probably going to have to go up against God is really interesting as well, and it gives a much bigger bad guy than the other books on this list so far. Plus, our main character is a retired warrior who is kind of too old for this shit, and I'm really interested to see how our main character acts and how he reacts to having to go back to the Barrowlands. So first impressions, Aching God starts off in a nightmare, and I didn't hate this because it immediately gives our character kind of the motivations and the backstory that we need to understand him. He's a retired warrior. We know that whilst he wasn't retired, certain things happened which makes him have these nightmares, but also have a lot of grief and not wanting to go back and fight. Plus, because the scene was so action orientated, it really pulled you into the book almost immediately. Like, you wanted to know what was happening, who was chasing them, who was fighting them, how they were going to get out of this. And then he wakes up and you're like, oh, okay. But then it continues with kind of character development and setting up the storyline for this book rather than his backstory. So I actually like that Ulrich was said to be in his 50s and retired, because it makes him a little bit different to the other books I've read for forever, I guess. Most of my YA books are obviously YA protagonists. Most of my fantasy books are maybe not teenagers, but they are definitely still young people. Like, they are warriors. They've only been on this world for a certain amount of time. But yeah, he's retired from the Cyrillic League, and he now has a little house with a handful of servants, and he has a dog called Margaret and a horse called Glutton. And I really enjoyed reading about his retired life because, you know what, a little dog called Margaret would be lovely to have. However, he's very quickly called away from retirement to go help save his daughter, who is also in the Cyrillic League. The world building in this book is very centered around kind of religion and culture. We are told all about the different gods that people believe in. We actually meet like a priest and then the head of the religious order of the Mother. But we do learn that there's multiple gods throughout this world, and people can pray to different ones. But in the city we go to at the beginning, which is called Borden, I think, there's a lot of religious disarray, and people are not praying to certain gods. A lot of the temples have been graffitied on and destroyed, or are just empty of people. One aspect that I really did pull out of this book, though, was little aspects of world building that you don't really see in the books. I liked that it was mentioned that people were graffitiing the city walls, because it gives a little bit of more in-depth view of the people in this world. This world isn't revolving just around this main storyline. There are people that are still doing kind of vandalizing things, and it shows that there's people off page that are doing things that are completely not relevant to the storyline at all, but there are people and there's depth to the world. We also learn that Auric has been to the Barrowlands before, and that is why he's having nightmares. But that in order to save his daughter, he's going to have to go back to them, and he's going to have to kind of stand up against his fear and his grief and his loss. I'm really excited to read that. Like, a lot of this book I was just wanting to read more and more. Those are the 5 books so far in 2018 finalists that I've read. I really enjoyed 2 of them, so 2 out of 3 isn't too bad. It's probably better for my TBR that way as well, since last week I think I wanted to read all of them. But yeah, hopefully you catch up in the next couple of days when I release the next video of the other 5, and you enjoy that one too. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.